Welcome to this edition of Diligent Institute's Inside Today's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about the 3 keys to building an effective board chief compliance officer relationship. And joining me to have this discussion is David Greenberg, who's a board member with International Seaways. Welcome, David.
Great to be here, TK.
We both know that compliance is an important part of every company's board meeting. And David, you've sat on every conceivable side of the table on this issue. You've been a chief compliance officer. You've established yourself as a consulting compliance expert. And now you sit on the board chairing a committee with compliance and ethics oversight responsibility. So I'd say you have this topic covered pretty well. So let's start this discussion by reviewing where we think compliance is valued and ranked on the board's focus hierarchy.
If you're as old as I am, you remember a TV show called The Naked City. And the tagline was, there are 8 million stories in the naked city. And for every corporation, there's a different story here. But there are some commonalities. So let me tell you one of those stories. A chief compliance officer gets his or her report ready for the audit committee, let's say, working weeks in advance to really prepare a fantastic summary of what's happened, what the strategy is, what's coming, what to think about, what the board should focus on. And we get to the audit committee, the agenda is packed, and at the end of the meeting, the chairman looks at the agenda and says, oh, you know what, TK, I know you were supposed to give your compliance report, but we've got your report in the pre-read materials and we're just not going to have time. So we'll catch you next time. Now, I wish that story were made up, but I've heard it from dozens and dozens of chief compliance officers. So there's a real problem with the message that sends. What's the message sent to the chief compliance officer? What's the message sent to management? What's the message sent to the board? It's that this hasn't really made it to the grown-ups table yet. And that's a big problem. It's a lack of time. It's a lack of priority. It's a lack of strategy. It's a lack of relationships, depth, measurement, accountability, all of those. Having said that, there are, of course, shining examples of getting it right as well.
Well, I'll support that by every study that we have done, ranking what interests board members the most. Strategy is always at the top, and unfortunately, compliance is always at the bottom until there's a big incident, okay? And unfortunately, David, as we both know, that's too late, to start focusing on compliance. So let's make this constructive. What would you offer as the 3 keys to building an effective board and chief compliance officer relationship?
The first thing is you mentioned strategy, and compliance needs to move from tactical to strategic. And it needs to move from a program to something that's built into the gears of a business. I was a senior corporate executive for 20 years, long before I had ever even heard of compliance. And one thing I knew was when the company created a new program, it was likely to be flavor of the day and die on the vine. There is a series of gears and levers that run every business. I call it the machine. And if you're trying to get something done and make something important, it's got to be part of the machine. It's got to be built into the gears. And compliance in many companies is simply still a program, not something built into the gears, the fabric, the DNA of a company. So that's one thing. A second thing, which falls out from that, is unfortunately, many board members couldn't pick their chief compliance officer out of a lineup. And that is not a very good recipe for when the going gets tough, the chief compliance officer to have the courage to go to the CEO, the chairman of the audit committee, or the chairman of the board to say something is wrong. Again, we kind of need to elevate this function to the grown-ups table because it deserves it. You cannot get compliance right without getting culture right. And culture is, a very complex equation of human behavior. And if you're going to try to influence human behavior in an organization, you need every tool imaginable, you need every function involved, you need every leader involved. And that's just not the story of compliance. The final thing I'd say on that is that accountability is in the wrong place oftentimes. A chief compliance officer, no matter how experienced or effective he or she is not the ultimate point of accountability for compliance outcomes. That is senior management. It has to be across the board. It has to be built into objectives. It has to be part of the overall business strategy. And we're taking on issues like very deep issues like the risks that modern corporations face, the rampant problem of fear of retaliation for people who come forward, the whole connection between culture and compliance outcomes. If you're going to take those issues on and get them right, it's an across the board management responsibility with the compliance officer as a really good coach. And that's what they ought to be. And that doesn't happen a lot. They tend to be more isolated. They tend to not have the relationships they need. And it's just not a good recipe for getting things right.
Yeah, I think your story in the beginning is very typical in the sense of, and sadly, it's not just the chief compliance officer. There's other officers within the company that I don't think get much focus as well. And I think it's only when the board, has a mini catastrophe or a major catastrophe that we sort of see that stuff bubble up to the top. So if somebody has a foreign corrupt practices violation or something like that, they will learn very quickly the importance of compliance.
TK, I would say even in those instances, I've been through many situations where boards and management don't go deep enough to try to understand how and why something like that happens. No one authorizes illegal activity. No one wants illegal activity in general. So why does it happen? As I said, it's a complex equation about human behavior. And if you're going to try to get that right, you need to go deep. And boards have not taken the time in general to go deep on these issues. Some have.
So here's the $64,000 question. So what should a chief compliance officer do if they can't seem to get the board's attention?
They need to play bigger. And by that, I mean they need to explain compliance as a matter of culture, a matter of strategy. They have to ask deep questions. Why do things go wrong in this company? And what's the evidence for that? They have to measure different things than sometimes get measured in compliance. Compliance should not be about counting how many calls there were to a hotline. Compliance should be about asking how much misconduct is there in this company? What are the causes of it? What do we do to change it? And what's the plan to cut it in half, for example? So they've got to ask those bigger questions. If they're having trouble, they need to figure out who on the board might have the institutional role or the interest to go deeper on this and take him or her to breakfast or lunch and have a deep discussion. Try to leverage the people in executive management who believe in taking action on compliance and see it as a matter of culture. Sometimes it takes some outside perspective. I know as a board member, we're often fascinated when we have outside speakers come to talk on a given topic. And sometimes they'll say the same thing that someone in management might say, but we give them more attention and more credibility. And I think that, anyone who has history and experience in compliance and corporate misconduct can come in and tell some stories and give some perspective about what governments are doing, what the Justice Department is doing, what we're finding in culture surveys, what a good risk assessment looks like, and what a good overall approach to compliance and culture looks like. And I think many companies will find if they get some of that outside perspective, it may scare them a little bit about what they're doing.
Well, I certainly believe that if the CEO embraces compliance, that's step number one to making sure that the board will pay more attention to it, or they can make time for the board to pay attention to it. So, listen, David, this is a topic that we don't cover much, but certainly is important. I want to thank you for taking the time to pass along your wisdom today. And really appreciate you joining us.
My pleasure.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligent Institute's Inside Today's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.